"You're not welcome this year, Margaret," my daughter-in-law said, lifting her mimosa like she was toasting to something worth celebrating. "Mother's Day is for real mothers." I remember the way the words landed. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise, like something carefully practiced and finally delivered at the perfect moment. And what struck me wasn't the cruelty, but the timing, because the dining room smelled like fresh coffee and warm cinnamon rolls. The table was set with white plates and folded linen napkins, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows exactly the way it used to when Daniel was a boy and would run down the stairs barefoot, calling out, "Happy Mother's Day, Mom!" before wrapping his arms around me like I was the center of his entire world. But that morning at 68 years old, I stood in the same kind of light and realized I had become something else entirely, something inconvenient, something removable, and I didn't argue, I didn't ask her to repeat herself, I didn't even look at my son right away, because I already knew what I would see, that quiet, practiced silence he had learned over the years, the kind that chooses comfort over truth. So instead I reached for my purse, smoothed the front of my navy dress and said, "Of course," like I had simply been reminded of an appointment I'd forgotten, and as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of Ashley's reflection in the glass cabinet, her smile small and satisfied, like she had finally corrected something that had been bothering her for a long time. And that was the moment I understood this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a careless comment or a misunderstanding. This was a decision, something built quietly over months, maybe years, shaped in conversations I was never part of, in glances exchanged across tables where I was still sitting but no longer included. And I stepped outside into the late May air, warm and soft against my skin, and closed the door behind me without another word, because there are moments in life when silence says more than anything you could fight to explain. And as I walked down the front steps, I could still hear faint laughter from inside, the clink of glass, the low hum of music, a celebration continuing as if I had never been part of it to begin with. And I paused just long enough to take a breath, not because I was about to cry, but because something inside me had shifted, something subtle but final, like a lock clicking into place, and I realized that what Ashley had taken from me in that moment wasn't my place at the table. It was the illusion I had been holding on to for far too long, the belief that love alone was enough to keep you rooted in a family that had quietly learned how to live without you. And as I reached my car, I caught my reflection in the window, silver hair neatly styled, lipstick still perfect, posture straight, and I thought about all the years I had spent making sure everyone else felt seen, remembered, celebrated, the birthday cakes, the late-night phone calls, the holidays planned down to the smallest detail, all of it offered freely without expectation. Because that's what mothers do, or at least that's what I believed, and yet standing there in my own driveway, on a day meant to honor women like me, I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being someone they honored and started being someone they managed, someone they tolerated, someone they could politely remove when it no longer suited them. And the strangest part wasn't the hurt, it was the clarity, because for the first time in years everything made sense, the missed invitations, the last-minute changes, the way Ashley would smile and say, "Oh, I thought Daniel told you," and Daniel would avoid my eyes and shrug like it was nothing more than a scheduling mix-up, small things that I had explained away, forgiven, forgotten. But now, standing alone in the quiet, those moments lined up perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle finally forming a picture I could no longer ignore. And I placed my hand on the car door but didn't open it right away, because I wasn't in a hurry, not anymore, and I let the silence settle around me, not heavy, not suffocating, just still. And in that stillness, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before, that this wasn't the day I lost my place in their lives. This was the day I stopped pretending I still had one. And as that thought settled calm and steady, I found myself smiling, not the polite smile I had worn inside, not the one meant to keep the peace, but something quieter, something stronger, because Ashley thought she had excluded me. She thought she had drawn a line and decided where I belonged. But what she didn't understand, what neither of them understood yet, was that the moment they pushed me out was the moment I finally stepped back far enough to see everything clearly. And once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it, and you certainly don't keep playing the same role in a story that was never written with you in mind. I drove home slowly that morning, not because there was traffic or anywhere else I needed to be, but because for the first time in years, I did not feel the need to rush back into a life that no longer had a place for me. And when I pulled into my driveway, everything looked exactly as it always had, the trimmed hedges, the quiet street, the porch swing Daniel had helped me hang 15 years ago, back when he still showed up on weekends with a toolbox and a smile that made me believe I had done something right as a mother, and I sat in the car for a moment longer than usual, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, letting the silence settle around me in a way that felt unfamiliar but not entirely unwelcome. And when I finally stepped inside, the house greeted me the same way it always did, still, orderly, untouched. But there was a difference I could not ignore, not in the walls or the furniture, but in the way I moved through it, slower, more aware, as if I were seeing it from a distance rather than living inside it. And I walked into the kitchen and noticed the small details first: the coffee mug I had left in the sink from the night before, the folded dish towel on the counter, the calendar pinned to the wall with a neat red circle around that day, Mother's Day, written in my own careful handwriting, a reminder of something I had once looked forward to. And I reached up and removed the page without thinking, folding it once, then again before setting it aside, not with anger, not with regret, just with a quiet sense of finality that surprised me with how steady it felt. And I poured myself a cup of coffee even though I no longer wanted it, more out of habit than desire, and carried it to the dining room where the table sat perfectly arranged from the night before. I had prepared it out of routine, out of hope perhaps, a small arrangement of flowers in the center, the good plates taken out from the cabinet, everything ready for a gathering that was never going to happen. And I stood there for a moment, looking at the empty chairs, imagining for just a second what it would have looked like if things had been different. Daniel sitting across from me, reaching for the salt the way he always did, Ashley smiling in that polished way she had perfected. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember when those images were real, when they did not feel like something borrowed from another life. But the moment passed quickly, not because it was painful, but because it no longer held the same weight. And I set the coffee cup down untouched and began clearing the table one piece at a time, each plate lifted, each napkin folded, movements precise and unhurried, not the actions of someone defeated, but of someone closing a chapter that had quietly ended long before she acknowledged it. And as I worked, small memories surfaced without warning, not dramatic ones, not the kind that make you stop and hold your breath, but the quiet ones that linger in the background. Daniel forgetting to call on my birthday 2 years ago. Ashley rearranging holiday plans at the last minute, always with a soft explanation that sounded reasonable if you did not look too closely. And I realized that what had happened that morning was not an isolated moment. It was simply the first time it had been said out loud, the first time the unspoken rules had been made clear enough that I could no longer pretend I did not understand them. And I carried the last plate back into the kitchen and placed it carefully in the sink, turning on the water and watching as it ran over the surface, clear and steady. And I let my hands rest there for a second longer than necessary, feeling the warmth, grounding myself in something simple and certain. And when I turned it off, the silence that followed felt different from the one I had left behind earlier, not empty, not hollow, but calm in a way that made room for something new. And I dried my hands slowly and walked back into the living room, where the afternoon light had begun to shift, stretching across the hardwood floor in long, soft lines. And I sat down in my usual chair, the one near the window. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself to do nothing at all, no planning, no anticipating, no adjusting myself to fit into someone else's expectations, just sitting there breathing, letting the quiet settle in a way that did not feel like loss but like space. And it was in that space that something became clear, something I had not been able to admit before, that I had spent years holding together a version of family that only existed as long as I continued to carry it. And the moment I stopped, the moment I stepped outside of it, it did not fall apart, it simply continued without me. And that realization did not break me the way I might have expected, it steadied me, because if I was no longer needed in the way I had always believed, then I was no longer bound by the same quiet obligations that had shaped my choices for so long. And as I sat there, watching the light move across the floor, I felt something shift again, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough to notice, like the first sign of a change in direction. And I understood that whatever came next would not be about finding my way back into a place that had already closed its doors. It would be about deciding, for the first time in a very long time, where I wanted to go instead. The next morning arrived without announcement, no phone call, no message, no small attempt to smooth over what had been said the day before. And that silence told me more than any explanation ever could, because in the past there had always been something, a delayed apology, a quick excuse, a light-hearted comment meant to shift the tone. But this time there was nothing at all, and I found myself noticing that absence in small ways, the stillness of my phone on the kitchen counter, the absence of Daniel's name lighting up the screen. the quiet that stretched through the house as the hours passed, and I moved through my morning the same way I always had, making coffee, opening the curtains, stepping out onto the porch to check the mail. But everything felt slightly different, not heavier, not sadder, just clearer, as if the background noise I had grown used to had finally faded enough for me to hear what had always been there underneath. And as I stood at the mailbox, flipping through envelopes and advertisements, I caught myself thinking about a conversation from 3 months earlier, something that had seemed insignificant at the time, Daniel mentioning in passing that they were considering restructuring things for the future, his tone casual, almost rehearsed, and Ashley standing beside him with that same composed smile, adding that it would make everything easier for everyone. And I remembered how I had nodded, trusting that whatever they were planning included me in some natural, unspoken way, because that is what I had always believed, that family did not need to say these things out loud, that belonging was understood. But now, standing there with a stack of unopened mail in my hands, I realized how carefully that assumption had been used against me, how easily silence can be mistaken for agreement when you are the only one not being told the full story. And I brought the mail inside and set it on the table without sorting through it, my attention drifting instead to the quiet rhythm of the house, the ticking clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator, steady sounds that had nothing to do with anyone else, and I sat down slowly, letting the chair settle beneath me, and allowed my thoughts to move back further, past the recent months, past the small inconsistencies I had overlooked, to moments that had once felt harmless, Ashley taking over holiday planning without asking, Daniel deferring to her in conversations where he used to speak first, decisions made quickly, and presented to me as if they were already settled, and I realized that none of it had been sudden, none of it had begun that morning at the brunch table. It had been building quietly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for me to hold on to except the version of things I had chosen to believe, and that realization did not come with anger, not the kind that demands action or confrontation, but with something steadier, something that allowed me to sit there and see it fully without looking away. And I stood up and walked into the hallway, passing the framed photographs that lined the wall, Daniel at 10 years old with a missing front tooth, Daniel at 18 standing proudly in his graduation gown, Daniel on his wedding day, smiling in a way that seemed so certain, so confident, and I paused in front of that last photo for a moment longer than the others, not because I was searching for something, but because I was finally seeing it without the layer of meaning I had always placed over it. The way Ashley stood slightly ahead of him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression composed, controlled, already positioned at the center of something I had thought we all shared. And I moved past the photo and into my bedroom, opening the top drawer of my dresser where I kept documents I rarely needed to look at, old insurance papers, bank statements, records of things that had always been handled quietly in the background of my life, and I flipped through them slowly, not searching for anything specific, just reacquainting myself with the details I had once trusted others to understand on my behalf. And as I read through the pages, numbers, dates, names, I felt a different kind of awareness begin to take shape, one that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with clarity, because the truth was simple, far simpler than I had allowed myself to believe. Everything I had built, everything I had maintained over the years, was still mine to understand, still mine to decide, and the idea that I had somehow been gently moved to the edges of it all was not something that had happened overnight. It had happened because I had allowed it to remain unexamined, unchallenged, and I closed the drawer carefully, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with intention, and I returned to the living room where the light had shifted again, softer now, stretching across the floor in a way that marked the passing of time without asking anything from me. And I sat down once more, this time not as someone waiting for something to change, but as someone beginning to understand that change had already taken place, and that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been taken from me, but by what I chose to do with what remained. That afternoon, I found myself pulling out a box I had not opened in years, the kind of box you carry from one house to another without ever quite deciding what to do with it, tucked neatly in the back of the closet as if it belonged to a version of life you had already finished living. And I set it on the bed and lifted the lid slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I already knew what was inside: photographs, letters, small things that once held entire worlds within them. And I reached in and picked up the first picture, Daniel at 5 years old, standing in the backyard with a paper crown on his head, the kind that came from a fast food restaurant, grinning like he had just been handed something priceless, and I could almost hear his voice again, the way he used to call out to me from across the yard. asking if I was watching, always needing to know I was there. And I remembered how I would drop whatever I was doing just to stand by the window and wave back, because in those days being needed felt like the most natural thing in the world, something that would never change. And I set the picture down and picked up another, Daniel at 12, sitting at the kitchen table late at night, book spread out in front of him, frustration written all over his face as he tried to understand something that did not come easily. And I could see myself in that memory, sitting across from him, explaining things slowly, patiently, staying up long after I should have gone to bed. Because he mattered more than sleep, more than anything. And I realized as I held that photograph that I had never once kept track of what it cost me. Not the hours, not the sacrifices, not the quiet things I gave up without ever naming them. Because that is not how love works when you are a mother. You do not measure it. You do not expect it to return in equal parts. You simply give, and you believe that somewhere along the way, it becomes part of the foundation of something lasting, something steady. And I reached deeper into the box and pulled out a letter, folded carefully, the paper slightly worn at the edges, and I recognized the handwriting immediately, Daniel's, uneven and slanted, written during his first year of college, and I unfolded it slowly, reading the words again for the first time in a long while. Thank you for everything you have done for me, Mom. I would not be here without you. Simple words, nothing elaborate, but at the time they had meant everything. They had been proof that the years had not gone unnoticed, that the connection we had built was still there, even as his life began to move in directions I could not fully follow. And I sat down on the edge of the bed, the letter resting lightly in my hands, and I allowed myself to feel the distance between that moment and now, not as a wound but as a fact, something that existed whether I acknowledged it or not. And I thought about the day he introduced me to Ashley, the way he had looked at her, certain, proud, convinced that he had found something that would shape the rest of his life. And I remembered how I had welcomed her without hesitation, how I had stepped back in small ways to make room for her presence, adjusting traditions, changing plans, telling myself that this was what it meant for a family to grow, to evolve, and I had believed that there would always be space for me within that change, that stepping back did not mean stepping out, but somewhere along the way that line had blurred, so gradually that I had not noticed when one became the other. And I placed the letter back into the box and closed the lid gently, not because I wanted to put those memories away, but because I no longer needed to hold on to them in the same way. They were not evidence I had to present, not proof I needed to defend, they were simply part of what had been, and I stood up and carried the box back to the closet, placing it carefully on the shelf. And as I stepped away, I realized that the weight I had been carrying all these years was not the past itself, but the expectation that it should still define the present, that everything I had given should guarantee something in return, a place, a role, a sense of belonging that could not be taken away. But the truth was quieter than that, less dramatic and far more freeing, because nothing I had done had been wasted, nothing I had given had been meaningless, it simply did not belong to the version of my life that I was now stepping into. And as I closed the closet door and walked back into the room, I felt that same steady clarity from before, not sharp, not overwhelming, just present, like a line drawn gently but firmly separating what had been from what would come next. And for the first time I understood that letting go was not about losing something, it was about no longer holding yourself in a place where you were no longer meant to stay. 2 days passed before the first interruption came, not dramatic, not urgent, just a phone call in the late afternoon when the light had already begun to soften across the living room floor. And I watched my phone ring from where it sat on the side table, Daniel's name appearing on the screen as if nothing had changed, as if the silence between us had not stretched long enough to say everything that needed to be said. And I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before reaching for it, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be certain of something before I answered, that I was no longer stepping into the same role I had always played. And when I finally picked up, my voice was steady, "Hello, Daniel." And there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that fills with unspoken calculations, as if he had expected something different, something softer, more familiar, and he cleared his throat lightly before speaking. "Hey Mom, I just wanted to check in, see how you are doing." His tone careful, measured, the way people speak when they are trying to keep things simple, manageable, and I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet of the room settle around me as I considered his words, not what he said, but what he did not say, no mention of that morning, no acknowledgement of what had been done or how it might have felt, just a gentle attempt to move forward as if nothing had shifted. And I realized in that moment that this, more than anything else, was the pattern I had lived inside for years, the ability to smooth over discomfort by refusing to name it, to continue as if everything remained intact simply because no one was willing to say otherwise, and I responded calmly, "I am doing just fine." And the truth of that statement surprised me with how easily it came, because I was not pretending, not adjusting, just stating something that had become real in a way I had not expected. And there was another pause, shorter this time, before he continued, "Ashley thought maybe we could all get together next weekend, nothing big, just dinner." And I could almost hear the shape of that suggestion, the quiet expectation that I would accept, that I would return to the table without question, without condition, and I let my gaze drift toward the window, watching the way the light moved slowly across the glass. And I thought about how many times I had said yes before even considering what it meant, how easily I had stepped back into place whenever the door was open just enough to let me in, and I answered without raising my voice, without adding anything unnecessary, "That will not be necessary." And the silence that followed was different this time, not uncertain, not searching, but solid, as if something had been placed firmly between us that could not be easily moved. And Daniel shifted slightly. I could hear it in the faint rustle on the line, and he spoke again, a little more quickly now. "Mom, it is just dinner, we thought it would be nice." And I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of frustration, but to let the clarity settle fully before I responded, "I am sure it would be nice for you." And I let the words rest there, not sharp, not accusatory, just complete, and there was a longer pause this time, one that stretched enough for him to realize that the conversation was not following its usual path. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not quite understanding, not quite resistance. "I do not understand what the problem is." And I opened my eyes and looked around the room, at the familiar space that had begun to feel different. In the past few days, not smaller, not emptier, but more defined, as if it finally belonged to me in a way it had not before, and I said quietly, "There is no problem, Daniel." And I meant it, because what had changed was not something that needed to be argued or explained, it simply existed. And he let out a breath on the other end, a small sound that carried more weight than his words, and I could feel him searching for the right way to respond, the way he always had, trying to find the balance that would keep everything steady without requiring him to step too far in any one direction. And I realized then that nothing about this was new for him, only for me, and that realization did not bring disappointment, only understanding, and I continued, my tone unchanged. "I think it is best if we take some time." And I did not elaborate, did not offer a timeline or a condition, because I was not asking for permission or agreement. I was stating something that had already begun. And there was another pause, quieter now, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, uncertain in a way I had not heard in years. "Okay." And the simplicity of that response told me more than anything else could have, that he did not know how to follow me into this new space, and I did not expect him to, not yet, and I ended the call a moment later, not abruptly, not coldly, just with a quiet, "Take care, Daniel." And when the line went silent, I placed the phone back on the table and sat there for a while, not replaying the conversation, not questioning what I had said, just allowing the stillness to return. And as I looked out the window, watching the last of the afternoon light settle into evening, I understood that something had shifted again, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that changed the direction of everything that would come next, because for the first time, I had not adjusted myself to fit the space they offered me. I had simply stepped out of it entirely, and the quiet that followed did not feel like absence, it felt like control. The following morning felt different in a way that was not immediately obvious. Nothing in the house had changed. The same soft light filtered through the curtains, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen, but there was a steadiness in the air that had not been there before, as if something had settled into place overnight. And I moved through my routine without thinking, making coffee, opening the windows, letting in the early summer air that carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere down the street, and I found myself noticing things I had overlooked for years, the way the sunlight hit the edge of the countertop, the faint creak in the floor near the hallway, small details that had always been there but had never felt like they belonged entirely to me. And I realized that for a long time, my attention had been somewhere else, focused outward, always anticipating, always adjusting, always making space for others, and now with that weight lifted even slightly, everything seemed clearer, more defined, and I carried my coffee into the living room and sat down in the same chair as the day before, but this time there was no sense of waiting attached to it, no quiet expectation that something would interrupt the stillness, and as I sat there, my mind returned briefly to the call from Daniel, not replaying the words, but considering the shift beneath them, the way he had hesitated, the way uncertainty had crept into his voice, and I understood that what had changed was not just my response, but the structure he had come to rely on, the predictable rhythm of how things had always worked between us, and for the first time I had stepped outside of that rhythm, and that alone was enough to unsettle everything that depended on it. And I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle, and I allowed myself to consider what that meant moving forward, not in terms of confrontation or correction but in terms of choice, something I had not fully exercised in years, because I had been too busy maintaining something that no longer existed in the way I believed it did. And I set the cup down and stood up, walking toward the small desk in the corner of the room, the one I had not used in a long time, where papers had accumulated quietly over the months, unopened envelopes, statements, notices, things that had always seemed less urgent than the immediate needs of others, and I began sorting through them carefully, not rushing, not skimming, but reading each page with attention, taking in the details I had once trusted would simply take care of themselves. And as I worked, a pattern began to emerge, not something alarming, not something dramatic, but something precise, something that revealed how much of my life had been structured in ways I had not fully examined. Accounts, documents, small decisions made over time that had shaped the foundation beneath everything else, and I realized that this was where my focus needed to be now, not on what had been said or done, but on what remained within my control, and I organized the papers into neat stacks, separating what was current from what needed attention, creating order where there had once been quiet neglect. And there was something grounding in that process, something that required no emotion, no interpretation, just clarity and intention. And when I finished, I sat down at the desk and rested my hands lightly on the surface, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, and I understood that this was not about reacting, not about proving anything to anyone. It was about reestablishing something that had slowly drifted out of my hands without my noticing. And I thought again about Ashley, about the confidence in her voice, the certainty in her words, and I saw it differently now, not as something to challenge directly, but as something built on assumptions that had never been questioned, assumptions about what I would accept, how I would respond, where I would remain. And for the first time, I saw those assumptions clearly enough to understand how easily they could unravel, not through force, not through confrontation, but through quiet decisions made consistently, deliberately. And I reached for a blank sheet of paper and began writing a short list, not of grievances, not of things to address, but of steps, simple, practical steps that would bring everything back into alignment with the reality I was now choosing to step into. And as I wrote, each word felt steady, intentional, free of hesitation. And when I finished, I looked at the list for a moment before setting the pen down, and I felt that same quiet certainty from before, stronger now, more defined, not something that needed to be expressed outwardly, but something that would shape everything that followed. And I leaned back slightly in the chair and let out a slow breath, not out of relief but out of recognition, because this was not the beginning of something new in the way I had once imagined change to be. It was the return to something that had always been mine, something I had simply allowed to fade into the background while I focused on holding everything else together. And now, with that focus shifted, I could see it clearly again, steady, intact, waiting for me to step fully into it without hesitation, without apology, without looking back. By the third day, the quiet had settled into something steady, something that no longer felt like an absence but a structure, and I woke earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because my mind felt clear in a way it had not for a long time, and I moved through the house with a sense of purpose that did not need to announce itself, making coffee, opening the windows, letting in the morning air that carried the soft sounds of the neighborhood coming to life, distant car doors, a dog barking somewhere down the block, small, ordinary things that grounded the moment in something real and present. And after I finished in the kitchen, I returned to the desk where I had left everything neatly arranged the day before, the papers stacked, the list written in careful, deliberate lines, and I sat down and looked at it again, not to reconsider, not to adjust, but to confirm what I already knew, that this was no longer about reacting to what had been done. It was about moving forward with clarity. And I reached for the phone, not the one I had used to speak to Daniel, but the one that held numbers I had not dialed in years, and I scrolled slowly until I found the name I was looking for, Robert Hensley, the attorney who had helped me and my late husband organize our affairs long before Daniel had built his own life, long before Ashley had ever entered the picture. And I pressed call without hesitation, listening as the line rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. Older now but steady, professional, Hensley Law Office. And I introduced myself simply. This is Margaret Collins. And there was a brief pause before recognition settled in his tone. "Mrs. Collins, it has been a while." And I allowed myself a small, polite acknowledgement. "It has," before continuing. "I would like to schedule a meeting." And I did not explain further, did not offer context or justification because none was needed, and he agreed without question, offering me a time later that week. And when I ended the call, I set the phone down carefully, feeling the quiet weight of that decision settle into place, not dramatic, not urgent, but significant in a way that did not need to be stated aloud. And I looked around the room for a moment, taking in the familiar surroundings that now felt slightly different. Not because they had changed, but because I had, and I stood up and walked toward the hallway again, passing the photographs without stopping this time. Not because they no longer mattered, but because they no longer held me in place. And I stepped into the small study. At the back of the house, a room that had once belonged to my husband, where he used to sit in the evenings reviewing documents, balancing accounts, handling the quiet responsibilities that keep a life running smoothly. And I had rarely entered this space after he passed, not out of avoidance, but because it had felt like something separate, something that did not require my attention. And now, standing in the doorway, I saw it differently: the desk, the filing cabinet, the shelves lined with neatly labeled folders, all of it still intact, still organized, waiting to be understood rather than ignored. And I walked in slowly and ran my hand along the surface of the desk, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the reality of what I was stepping into. And I opened the top drawer, revealing rows of carefully arranged documents, each one placed with intention, each one part of a system that had been built over years of quiet diligence. And I began going through them methodically, not rushing, not skipping ahead, but taking the time to understand each piece, each account, each decision that had been made long before I realized I would one day need to see it all clearly on my own. And as I worked, a sense of calm settled over me, not the kind that comes from avoiding something difficult, but the kind that comes from facing it directly and finding that it is not as overwhelming as it once seemed. And I realized that this, more than anything else, was the foundation I had overlooked, the structure that existed independently of the shifting dynamics of family, something stable, something that did not rely on anyone else's approval or acknowledgement. And as I closed one folder and moved to the next, I felt a quiet certainty grow. Stronger, not in the sense of finality but in the sense of direction, because I understood now that whatever Ashley believed, whatever assumptions had been made about my place, my role, my limits, they had all been formed without a full understanding of what I had always held. And I did not feel the need to correct those assumptions immediately, did not feel the need to confront or reveal, because there is a difference between knowing something and needing others to know it, and for now, it was enough that I did, and I continued working until the light in the room shifted from morning to midday, until the stack of documents in front of me had been reduced to a clear, organized set of information I could act on. And when I finally stepped back, closing the drawer gently, I felt that same steady clarity settle once more, stronger now, more defined, and I understood that this was not preparation for a confrontation, not a response to a single moment of disrespect. It was the beginning of something much quieter and far more lasting, a shift in ownership, in awareness, in control. And as I left the room and closed the door behind me, I knew that the next steps would not require force or explanation, only patience, consistency, and the kind of quiet certainty that does not need to announce itself to be felt. The meeting with Robert Hensley was scheduled for Thursday morning, and when the day arrived, I dressed with the same quiet care I always had, not to impress, not to present anything to anyone, but because there was a dignity in routine that I had no intention of losing. And as I drove across town, the streets felt familiar in a distant way, the same shops, the same intersections, but I noticed them differently now. Not as part of a pattern I moved through without thinking, but as a series of choices, turns I could take or not take, directions that belonged entirely to me. And when I arrived at the office, I parked carefully and sat for a moment before stepping out, not hesitating, just allowing the stillness to settle, the same quiet clarity that had followed me through the past few days. And when I walked inside, the space was just as I remembered: polished wood, soft lighting, the faint scent of paper and leather that always seemed to accompany places where decisions were made without noise. And Robert greeted me with a professional warmth that had not changed over the years, his handshake steady, his expression attentive, and he led me into his office where everything was arranged with precision, files stacked neatly, a pen placed exactly parallel to the edge of the desk, details that reflected a life built on order and understanding. And as I sat down across from him, I placed my folder on the desk and folded my hands calmly, and for a moment neither of us spoke, not because there was uncertainty, but because there was no need to rush into what had already been decided, and when he finally asked, "How can I assist you today, Mrs. Collins?" I answered simply, "I would like to review everything," and he nodded without surprise as if he had been expecting something like this, and he began pulling files from the cabinet beside him, placing them one by one on the desk, explaining each document with careful clarity: accounts, property, trusts, arrangements that had been established years ago, some of them updated over time, others left unchanged, and I listened without interruption, not because I did not have questions, but because I understood that clarity comes first and reaction can wait, and as he spoke I saw the full picture take shape in a way I had not allowed myself to see before. The structure that had been built quietly beneath everything else. The one thing that had remained consistent even as relationships shifted and expectations changed. And when he finished, he looked at me with a measured expression, waiting, not for confusion, not for distress, but for direction, and I met his gaze steadily and said, "I would like to make some adjustments," and the words felt natural, not heavy, not charged, just necessary. And he nodded again, reaching for a pen, ready to note what needed to be done, and I outlined my decisions one by one, not rushed, not emotional, each point clear and deliberate, changes to how certain assets would be handled, how certain responsibilities would be assigned, not removing anything out of spite, not altering anything out of anger, but aligning everything with a reality that had finally been acknowledged, and as I spoke I could see that he understood, not just the specifics but the reasoning beneath them, the quiet shift that did not need to be explained in detail, and when I finished, he reviewed everything carefully, asking only what was necessary to ensure accuracy, and then he set the papers in front of me, indicating where I would need to sign, and I picked up the pen without hesitation, the weight of it familiar in my hand, and I signed each document with steady precision, my name appearing line after line in the same careful script I had used for years. But this time it felt different, not because the action had changed, but because the intention behind it had, and when I placed the pen back on the desk, there was a brief moment of silence, not empty, not uncertain, just complete, and Robert gathered the documents and nodded once more. "Everything will be updated accordingly," and I acknowledged him with a small, polite smile before standing, smoothing the front of my jacket as I did, and as I left the office, stepping back into the afternoon light, I felt that same quiet certainty settle once again, stronger now, more grounded, not something that needed to be shared or explained, but something that would reveal itself in time, through actions rather than words, and as I walked back to my car, I realized that nothing about what I had done required confrontation. Nothing needed to be announced or defended, because the most significant changes are often the ones made without noise, the ones that reshape everything quietly, leaving others to discover them only when they no longer fit into the structure they once relied on. And as I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, I did not feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was moving forward with something firmly in place, something that would not shift or bend to accommodate expectations that no longer applied. And I understood then that the moment at that table had not been the end of anything. It had been the beginning of a clarity that would carry far beyond a single conversation, far beyond a single day, shaping everything that came next in ways that did not need to be seen to be felt. It was late afternoon when the message finally came, not a call this time, not even a full conversation, just a short text that appeared on my phone as I sat quietly in the living room, the light outside beginning to soften into that familiar golden shade that marked the end of the day. And I glanced at the screen without urgency, Daniel's name once again, followed by a simple line, "Mom, we need to talk," and I read it once, then set the phone back down without responding immediately, not because I was avoiding it, but because I no longer felt the need to react the moment something was placed in front of me, and I let the silence stretch for a while, listening to the steady rhythm of the house, the faint ticking of the clock, the distant sound of a car passing by, grounding myself in the present before deciding what came next. And when I finally picked up the phone again, I replied just as simply, "You can come by tomorrow afternoon." And I placed it back down without overthinking the wording, without adding anything unnecessary, because clarity no longer required explanation. And the next day arrived without tension, without anticipation, just another morning that unfolded quietly, the same routine, the same steady pace, and when the time came, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the engine shutting off, the brief pause that always comes before someone steps out, and I remained seated for a moment longer. Not out of reluctance, but because I wanted to meet the moment without rushing toward it. And when the doorbell rang, I stood and walked to the front door, opening it calmly to find Daniel standing there, his posture slightly stiff, his expression uncertain in a way that reminded me of years ago, when he would come to me unsure of how something would be received, and Ashley stood just behind him, composed as always, her presence controlled, measured, and I stepped aside without a word, allowing them to enter, the same house, the same space, but the dynamic within it no longer what it had once been. And we moved into the living room where they took their seats, Daniel on the edge of the couch, Ashley beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and I sat across from them in my usual chair, the one near the window, the light falling softly across the room, creating a quiet, almost neutral atmosphere that held no tension unless someone chose to bring it in, and for a moment no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to reveal the difference in how it was held. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, just present, and Daniel was the first to break it, his voice careful. "Mom, we think there has been a misunderstanding." And I listened without interrupting, my gaze steady, not challenging, not inviting, simply present, and Ashley followed, her tone smooth, practiced. "We were just trying to set some boundaries, nothing personal." And I allowed her words to settle in the space between us, noting the phrasing, the distance it created, the way it framed everything as something reasonable, something that should be accepted without question, and I responded calmly, "I understand exactly what you were doing." And I let that statement stand on its own, without elaboration, without accusation, and Daniel shifted slightly, glancing at Ashley before looking back at me. "Then you know it was not meant to hurt you." And I nodded once. A small, acknowledging gesture. Intent does not change what something is. And the room grew still again, not because the words were harsh, but because they were complete, leaving no space for reinterpretation, and Ashley straightened slightly, her composure tightening just enough to be noticeable. "We are just trying to build our own family," and I met her gaze evenly, "and you should." And there was no resistance in my voice, no trace of opposition, only agreement, and that seemed to catch her off guard more than anything else, because she had expected resistance, something to push against, something that would allow her to reinforce her position. And when it did not come, the structure of the conversation shifted in a way she had not anticipated, and Daniel spoke again, more quietly now. "So where does that leave things?" And I leaned back slightly in my chair, not to create distance, but because the answer was already clear, exactly where they are. And I watched as he tried to understand that, to fit it into the framework he was used to. But there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to adjust, and after a moment I added, not as an explanation but as a statement, "You have your life and I have mine." And the simplicity of it settled into the room with a finality that did not need emphasis. And Ashley's expression remained composed, but I could see the shift behind it, the realization that the role she had defined for me no longer applied, not because I had argued against it, but because I had stepped outside of it entirely. And Daniel looked at me for a long moment, searching for something that was no longer there. And I held his gaze calmly, without expectation, without disappointment, just clarity, and after a while, he nodded slowly, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed in a way he could not immediately fix, and they stood shortly after, the conversation ending not with resolution, but with understanding, and I walked them to the door, the same way I always had, the same familiar gesture, but when I closed it behind them, the house returned to its quiet state without the lingering weight that used to follow these interactions. And I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the door, and I realized that nothing about what had just happened required further thought. No replaying, no questioning, because the outcome had already been decided long before they arrived. And as I turned and walked back into the living room, the light had shifted once more, softer now, settling into the space with a calm that felt complete. And I understood that this was not an ending in the way it might appear from the outside. It was simply the point where everything aligned with what had already been true. And for the first time, I was no longer standing in a place that required me to be anything other than exactly who I was, without adjustment, without permission, without looking for a seat at a table that no longer defined my worth.